Don't trust him. The words were low, rough, and almost impossible to understand at first. But the terrified look on the zookeeper's face told everyone in the control room that he had heard them clearly. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The grainy black and white security footage showed a massive silverback gorilla sitting alone inside the dim enclosure at Westbrook Wildlife Center just after 2 a.m. Rain hammered against the reinforced glass while emergency lights flickered softly across the concrete floor. The gorilla, known as Milo, sat perfectly still with his broad shoulders hunched forward and his dark eyes locked on a maintenance worker standing outside the enclosure gate. Then, without warning, Milo slowly lifted his head and spoke again. Don't trust him. The maintenance worker stumbled backward so fast he nearly fell over a mop bucket before the footage abruptly cut to black. By the following morning, the leaked clip had exploded across the internet. Millions of people argued over whether it was real, fake, artificial intelligence, or some kind of sick publicity stunt. News stations replayed the footage nonstop while social media flooded with theories. Some people called Milo a miracle. Others called him dangerous. A few demanded the animal be removed immediately before something terrible happened. But inside Westbrook Wildlife Center, nobody was celebrating. Dr. Ethan Cole stared silently at the paused security footage from inside his cramped office, replaying the same 7 seconds again and again. Ethan had worked with gorillas for nearly 14 years, and during all that time, Milo had never spoken a single recognizable word. The silverback understood commands, solved puzzles faster than most primates ever recorded, and showed emotional awareness that often unsettled new staff members. But actual speech was impossible. At least that was what Ethan had believed until last night. A hard knock suddenly rattled his office door. "You've got reporters outside already?" said Zoo Director Helen Morris, as she stepped inside holding a tablet tightly against her chest. Her expression looked calm, but Ethan could see tension in her eyes. "This situation is spiraling out of control." Ethan rubbed his face tiredly. Maybe because a gorilla just warned someone on camera. Helen lowered her voice immediately. "We don't know what people heard." Ethan turned the monitor toward her and replayed the clip once more. The room filled with the distorted sound of rain before Milo's deep voice emerged again from the speakers. Even after hearing it a dozen times, the words still sent chills through Ethan's body. Helen quickly looked away. "We cannot allow the media to turn this into chaos," she said firmly. "Until we know exactly what's happening, nobody talks to reporters." But it was already too late. Outside the Wildlife Center, satellite news vans lined the parking lot, while crowds gathered near the entrance hoping for a glimpse of the famous talking gorilla. Among them stood investigative journalist Sarah Bennett, clutching a microphone beneath the cold Colorado drizzle, as she watched staff members rush nervously through the front gates. Sarah had covered enough scandals to recognize fear when she saw it, and everyone working at Westbrook looked afraid. Deep inside the primate wing, Milo sat quietly near the back wall of his enclosure, his enormous frame barely moving as visitors pressed against the glass, trying to record him on their phones. Some laughed nervously. Others shouted for him to speak again. But Milo ignored them all. His dark eyes remained fixed on one person standing near the enclosure entrance. A tall maintenance worker in a gray uniform named Victor Lane. The moment Victor stepped closer, something changed in Milo's expression. The silverback slowly stood to his full height, placed one massive hand against the glass, and stared directly at him without blinking. Victor froze, and for the first time that day, Milo smiled. Victor Lane forced a nervous laugh as several visitors pointed their phones toward Milo's enclosure, but the smile on his face disappeared almost immediately when the gorilla continued staring directly at him. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Milo watched people. It did not feel like the curious attention animals usually gave humans at the zoo. It felt calculated. A little girl standing near the glass suddenly tugged on her mother's jacket and whispered, "Mom, he looks angry." Her mother quickly pulled her away while nearby tourists continued arguing about whether the viral video was real. Inside the restricted hallway behind the enclosure, Ethan walked beside Helen Morris while 2 security guards monitored the growing crowd outside. "This is getting worse every hour," Helen muttered quietly. "The governor's office called 30 minutes ago. They want answers before this becomes national panic. Ethan barely listened. His attention remained fixed on Milo through the observation window. The silverback had still not moved away from the glass. "He is trying to tell us something?" Ethan said under his breath. Helen crossed her arms immediately. Or maybe he learned to mimic sounds. Ethan shook his head. That was not mimicry. He understood context. Before Helen could answer, Sarah Bennett appeared at the end of the hallway after slipping past a distracted employee near the front lobby. Her rain-soaked jacket clung to her shoulders as she raised her press badge quickly. "Sarah Bennett, Channel 8 News," she announced. "I only need 5 minutes." Helen's face hardened instantly. "You are not authorized to be back here." "Then explain why your gorilla is speaking English," Sarah replied calmly. Ethan noticed something different about her immediately. Unlike the other reporters screaming outside the gates, Sarah did not look excited. She looked concerned. Helen motioned for security, but Ethan stepped forward first. "Wait." Helen turned sharply toward him. "Ethan, absolutely not. If we keep hiding, people will assume the worst," Ethan replied. Sarah slowly approached the observation window and stared at Milo silently for several seconds. Most people reacted to the silverback with fear because of his enormous size, but Sarah seemed strangely focused on his eyes instead. Milo noticed her almost instantly. To Ethan's surprise, the gorilla relaxed slightly and lowered himself onto the concrete floor. "That is strange," Ethan whispered. Sarah glanced toward him. "What?" "He usually avoids strangers," Sarah kept, watching Milo carefully. "Maybe he does not think I am dangerous." The words hung awkwardly in the air. Ethan suddenly remembered the exact phrase from the leaked video. "Do not trust him." His stomach tightened. Before anyone spoke again, a loud crash echoed from outside the enclosure. One of the visitors had dropped a metal water bottle against the glass barrier. Several people laughed nervously, but Milo reacted immediately. The silverback stood upright so quickly that the entire crowd stumbled backward. Deep growls rumbled through the enclosure as Milo's eyes locked onto Victor again. Victor froze near the maintenance corridor while sweat visibly formed across his forehead. "Back away from the enclosure," Ethan instructed firmly. Victor obeyed without speaking, but Milo continued following him with his eyes until he disappeared through the security door. The moment Victor left, Milo calmed down again. Sarah noticed it too. "That is not random behavior," she said quietly. Ethan nodded slowly. "I know." Helen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You are both overthinking this. The animal is agitated because of the crowds." But even she did not sound convinced anymore. Sarah pulled out her phone and replayed the leaked clip once more. She listened carefully to the distorted audio before looking back toward Ethan. "What if Milo was not warning us about himself?" she asked softly. Ethan stared through the glass as Milo slowly approached the observation window again. The silverback lifted one massive hand and pressed it gently against the glass directly in front of Ethan. Then Milo turned his head slightly toward the empty hallway where Victor had disappeared. And this time Milo frowned. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Westbrook Wildlife Center had become tense enough that even regular visitors could feel it. Families who normally spent hours taking pictures and laughing near the exhibits now moved through the zoo in nervous silence, constantly glancing toward the primate wing, where security guards had quietly doubled their presence. News helicopters circled overhead while online videos about Milo continued spreading across the country faster than anyone. Inside the facility could control. But the strangest part was not the media chaos outside. It was Milo himself. Ethan sat alone inside the observation room reviewing old behavioral reports, while the silverback remained visible through the thick glass wall only 30 feet away. For years, Milo had been considered unusually intelligent even among gorillas. He solved pattern tests faster than most research animals, remembered faces after years apart, and often reacted emotionally when staff members argued nearby. But after the leaked footage, Ethan began noticing details he had somehow ignored before. Milo was not just reacting to human emotions. He was studying them. Every movement inside the enclosure now seemed intentional. When nervous visitors approached the glass, Milo ignored them completely. When children waved excitedly, he sometimes nodded softly or mirrored their gestures. But whenever Victor Lane entered the primate wing, Milo's behavior changed immediately. His posture stiffened. His eyes narrowed. Sometimes he even moved to place himself between Victor and the younger gorillas housed nearby. Ethan replayed footage from the previous month and noticed the pattern repeating again and again. It was impossible to ignore now. This cannot be coincidence, Ethan whispered to himself. Sarah Bennett leaned over his shoulder as another security clip played across the monitor. "Look at the timestamp," she said quietly. Ethan paused the footage. The recording showed Victor walking near one of the interior gates at 11:47 p.m. Milo had been asleep in the corner of the enclosure moments earlier, yet the second Victor appeared, the silverback sat upright and followed him silently through the glass partition until he disappeared from view. Sarah crossed her arms slowly. "He watches Victor differently than everyone else." Ethan nodded, almost like he is waiting for something. Before Sarah could answer, the office door suddenly burst open. Helen Morris entered looking furious while Officer Daniel Brooks followed close behind her. "The city wants temporary closure of the primate exhibit," Helen announced sharply. "And now people online are accusing our staff of abuse because of ridiculous conspiracy theories." Officer Brooks glanced toward the monitors uneasily. "With all respect, ma'am, the public is frightened. The video alone has already hit 12 million views." Helen pointed toward the screen impatiently. "Because people want drama. That is all this is." Ethan remained calm. "Then explain why Milo only reacts this way around Victor." For a brief second, Helen hesitated. It was subtle, but Sarah noticed it immediately. "Victor has worked here 6 years, Helen replied carefully. "Milo simply dislikes him." Sarah stepped forward. "Animals usually have reasons." Helen ignored her completely. "Starting tonight, Milo will remain isolated from the public until we regain control of this situation." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "You are locking him away?" "I am protecting this facility," Helen snapped. "And if another video leaks, every animal here could become part of a federal investigation." The room fell silent. Ethan suddenly realized something disturbing. Helen was not acting afraid of Milo. She was acting afraid of what Milo might reveal next. An hour later, as sunset darkened the Colorado sky outside, workers began guiding the remaining visitors toward the exits, while heavy rain clouds rolled over the zoo once again. Deep inside the nearly empty primate wing, Ethan approached Milo's enclosure alone, carrying a flashlight and a small tray of fruit. The silverback sat quietly near the back wall, almost hidden in shadow. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly as he stepped closer to the glass. Milo slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Ethan crouched lower, lowering his voice even further. "What are you trying to tell us?" For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Milo stood and approached the glass with slow, deliberate steps. His enormous hand pressed against the barrier directly across from Ethan's face. The silverback glanced once toward the dark hallway behind Ethan where Victor usually appeared every night. Then Milo looked back into Ethan's eyes and quietly whispered 2 words that made Ethan's blood run cold. "Bad man." The 2 words echoed inside Ethan's mind long after he left the enclosure that night. Bad man. Milo had not shouted them randomly or repeated sounds the way parrots copied human speech. The gorilla had spoken with intent, with meaning. Ethan barely slept as thunderstorms rolled across Colorado through the early morning hours, and by sunrise, the situation at Westbrook Wildlife Center had become even more chaotic. Protesters gathered outside the front entrance carrying signs demanding Milo's release, while others insisted the gorilla should be transferred to a government facility immediately. News anchors debated whether animals could truly understand morality, and social media users dissected every second of the leaked footage frame by frame. But inside the zoo, fear was spreading much faster than rumors online. Several employees quietly refused to work near the primate wing after dark. One in turn claimed she heard Milo whispering to himself late at night. Another swore the gorilla somehow knew staff names before hearing them spoken aloud. Ethan tried to dismiss the growing hysteria, But deep down, even he no longer knew what Milo was capable of understanding. Around noon, Ethan entered the staff cafeteria carrying a stack of printed behavioral reports. The room fell strangely silent the moment he walked in. Two employees quickly stopped talking while Victor Lane sat alone near the far wall stirring coffee without drinking it. Ethan noticed dark circles under Victor's eyes immediately. The man looked exhausted, nervous, almost paranoid. Victor glanced up briefly before lowering his gaze again. Ethan approached slowly. "You doing okay?" Victor forced a weak smile. "Not really." Ethan sat across from him carefully. "Milo reacts strongly whenever you are around. Do you know why?" Victor's spoon froze against the coffee cup. "It is an animal, Dr. Cole. Maybe he senses stress. Or maybe he remembers something." Victor looked up sharply at those words. For one uncomfortable second, neither man spoke. Then Victor suddenly stood from the table. "You people are acting like that thing is human," he muttered before walking away quickly. Ethan watched him leave with growing unease. Something about Victor's reaction felt wrong. Later that afternoon, Sarah Bennett reviewed hours of archived security footage inside the media office the zoo reluctantly provided her. Most clips showed normal activity around the facility, but one detail kept repeating often enough to catch her attention. Victor always entered the restricted lower maintenance corridor between 11 p.m. and midnight, usually alone. The hallway connected directly beneath the primate wing and was rarely used by regular staff. "Why would maintenance need access there every night?" Sarah asked quietly. Ethan leaned closer to the monitor. "Storage rooms, maybe." Sarah rewound the footage again. "Then why does Milo become agitated every single time?" Before Ethan could answer, alarms suddenly blared across the building. Both of them jumped to their feet as flashing red emergency lights illuminated the hallway outside. Staff members rushed past shouting instructions while visitors screamed in confusion somewhere near the front exhibits. "What happened?" Sarah asked. Ethan grabbed his radio immediately. "Primate wing disturbance," Officer Brooks answered through static. "Everyone stay clear." Ethan's stomach tightened as he sprinted through the hallway toward Milo's enclosure with Sarah close behind him. When they reached the observation deck, they found security guards surrounding the exhibit while nervous employees crowded behind safety barriers. Milo was slamming both hands against the glass repeatedly while deep angry growls echoed through the chamber. Children cried as families hurried away from the area. "What triggered him?" Ethan demanded. Officer Brooks pointed toward the maintenance entrance. Victor was cleaning near the rear corridor when Milo suddenly lost control. Ethan stared through the thick glass. Milo was not behaving wildly. He was focused. Every movement centered toward the same rear hallway behind the enclosure. Then Ethan saw something else. The door to the restricted maintenance corridor was slightly open. Victor stood just inside the darkness, gripping a flashlight with trembling hands. The moment Milo spotted him again, the silverback let out a roar so loud that several staff members backed away in panic. Helen Morris arrived seconds later, with armed tranquilizer staff behind her. "This ends now," she snapped. Ethan stepped directly in front of her. "No," Helen's eyes narrowed. "That animal is dangerous." Ethan looked back toward Milo, whose furious attention never once left Victor. "No," Ethan said quietly. "He is terrified." The primate wing remained under lockdown through the entire evening as heavy rain pounded against the roof of Westbrook Wildlife Center. Visitors had long since been evacuated, but inside the secured observation area, tension only continued growing stronger. Milo had finally calmed down after Victor disappeared from the maintenance corridor. Yet the image of the silverback slamming his hands against the glass still haunted everyone who witnessed it. Several employees now openly refused to enter the lower levels beneath the enclosure. Even Officer Brooks seemed shaken as he reviewed incident reports beside the security station. But Ethan could not stop thinking about one detail that nobody else seemed to notice. Milo had never tried to hurt anyone during the entire disturbance. He had only tried to stop Victor from entering the restricted hallway. Around 9:30 p.m., Sarah sat beside Ethan inside the monitoring office while dozens of security camera feeds flickered across the walls. Most of the zoo appeared dark and empty except for scattered emergency lights glowing through the storm outside. Sarah leaned closer toward one particular camera feed connected to the lower maintenance corridor beneath the primate wing. "There," she whispered suddenly. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The grainy footage showed Victor entering the restricted hallway shortly before midnight 3 nights earlier carrying a small metal case. He glanced around nervously before unlocking a side door hidden near the back of the corridor. "I have worked here 14 years, Ethan said quietly. "And I have never even seen that room." Sarah frowned. "Then why does Victor have access to it?" Before Ethan answered, another figure appeared in the footage. Milo. The silverback stood silently behind the reinforced interior gate above the corridor, watching Victor through the narrow opening in the concrete wall. Even on low-quality security footage, Milo's expression looked disturbingly human. Concerned, focused, almost desperate. Victor disappeared into the hidden room for nearly 20 minutes before reemerging alone. The second he walked away, Milo began pacing aggressively along the enclosure barrier overhead. Ethan replayed the footage 3 times. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. "Whatever is inside that room," Sarah whispered. "Milo knows about it." Ethan slowly stood. "We are going downstairs." 20 minutes later, Ethan, Sarah, and Officer Brooks quietly entered the lower maintenance level using an old employee access tunnel beneath the primate wing. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. Pipes rattled softly overhead while dim fluorescent lights buzzed against the concrete ceiling. The hallway itself looked abandoned, with layers of dust covering storage crates and unused equipment pushed against the walls. "This place feels wrong," Sarah muttered quietly. Brooks nodded. "Most staff never come down here." Ethan scanned the corridor until his flashlight landed on the same metal door from the security footage. There was no label, no warning sign, only a keypad lock mounted beside the frame. "Why would a storage room need security access?" Sarah asked. Ethan stepped closer, examining scratches around the handle. The door had been opened recently. Before anyone could react, footsteps suddenly echoed from somewhere farther down the hallway. The 3 froze instantly. Ethan quickly killed his flashlight while Brooks motioned them behind a row of old supply shelves. Seconds later, Victor Lane appeared at the far end of the corridor carrying the same silver metal case from the footage. He looked around nervously before approaching the locked room again. Sarah quietly raised her phone, recording everything. Victor entered a code into the keypad and disappeared inside. The door clicked shut behind him. Brooks exhaled slowly. "This is enough for probable cause," he whispered. But Ethan barely heard him anymore. His attention had shifted upward toward the ceiling. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the concrete above their heads. Milo, even from inside, the enclosure 1 level above them, the silverback somehow knew Victor was back in the hidden room again. The rumbling grew louder, slower, intentional. Sarah looked at Ethan with widening eyes. "He is trying to warn us." Then, from somewhere inside the locked room, they heard a faint sound that made all 3 of them go completely still. A frightened animal crying softly in the dark. The faint crying sound continued from inside the locked room, soft enough to almost blend with the buzzing fluorescent lights above the corridor. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he exchanged a stunned look with Sarah and Officer Brooks. Whatever Victor had hidden down there, Milo had known about it all along. Brooks quietly reached for the radio clipped to his belt, but Ethan grabbed his arm immediately. "Not yet," he whispered. "If Victor hears backup coming, he could disappear before we learn what is inside." Sarah kept recording with trembling hands while the 3 of them remained hidden behind the storage shelves. Through the narrow gap between dusty crates, they watched Victor reemerge from the locked room carrying several folders and a small cooler. He looked nervous now, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as though he sensed someone nearby. Then a deep rumbling vibration suddenly echoed through the ceiling again. "Milo." The sound was louder this time, more urgent. Victor froze instantly. Fear flashed across his face as he stared upward toward the primate enclosure above him. "Shut up," he muttered under his breath. Ethan's eyes widened. Victor was not angry. He was scared. Before Victor could move again, the emergency lights inside the corridor flickered unexpectedly. For a split second, the entire hallway went dark. When the lights returned, Victor had already started rushing toward the far exit, carrying the metal case tightly against his chest. "Go!" Brooks whispered sharply. The three stepped out from hiding at once. "Victor!" Brooks shouted. Victor stopped dead in the hallway, his face turning pale the moment he saw them. "Officer, I can explain." Brooks approached carefully. "Open the room." Victor shook his head immediately. "You do not understand." Ethan stepped closer. "Then help us understand." Victor's breathing became uneven as another low rumble vibrated through the ceiling overhead. Milo was still making noise directly above them, pacing hard enough to shake dust from exposed pipes. Sarah looked toward the locked door again. The crying inside sounded weaker now, smaller. "There are animals in there," she said quietly. Victor lowered his eyes. For several painful seconds, nobody spoke. Then Victor finally whispered something that made Ethan's stomach drop. "I was trying to save them." Brooks frowned. "Save them from what?" Victor looked toward the security cameras mounted in the hallway corners before speaking again. "Helen." Silence filled the corridor instantly. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Victor swallowed hard. "The zoo has been secretly selling sick and injured animals to private facilities for years. Some disappear completely. Others come back terrified." Sarah slowly lowered her phone. "That is impossible." "I thought so too," Victor replied weakly, "until I started working nights down here." He looked toward the locked room again. "I hid the ones I could not send away." Ethan felt dizzy trying to process the words. Milo had not been warning them about Victor. He had been warning them about something much bigger. Before anyone could react further, footsteps suddenly echoed from the upper staircase leading into the corridor. Helen Morris appeared at the entrance flanked by two armed security employees. The moment she saw Victor cornered beside the hidden room, her entire expression changed. "Step away from him," she ordered coldly. Brooks moved in front of Ethan and Sarah immediately. "Ma'am, we found unauthorized animals hidden down here." Helen's eyes narrowed toward Victor with visible fury. "You should have stayed quiet." Victor backed away trembling. "I could not keep doing this." Ethan looked between them in horror. "You knew." Helen ignored him completely and motioned toward the security staff. "Take them upstairs." At that exact moment, a deafening crash thundered through the ceiling overhead. Everyone froze. The entire corridor shook violently as alarms exploded. Throughout the building, Brooks grabbed his radio instantly. "What happened?" Panicked voice answered through static. "Milo escaped the interior gate." Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but Ethan realized something else immediately. Milo had heard everything. Heavy footsteps echoed above them as the silverback moved rapidly through the primate wing overhead. Then, for the first time since this nightmare began, Milo's voice roared through the building loud and clear for everyone to hear. "Help them!" The sound of Milo's voice echoing through the underground corridor sent pure panic across Westbrook Wildlife Center. Above them, alarms screamed nonstop while frightened employees rushed through the upper hallways trying to locate the escaped silverback. But Ethan stood frozen in place, staring at the ceiling in disbelief. Milo had not escaped to attack anyone. He had escaped because he knew the hidden animals downstairs were in danger. Helen Morris quickly stepped backward as the distant pounding footsteps overhead grew louder. "Sedation team is on the way," one of the security guards announced nervously into his radio. "No," Ethan snapped immediately. "Nobody touches him." Helen turned toward him furiously. "That animal is loose inside the facility. Because he is trying to save them," Ethan shouted back. Sarah Bennett moved toward the locked room while Brooks kept his attention fixed on Helen and the guards. The crying inside the hidden chamber had become louder now, filled with fear and confusion. Sarah grabbed the door handle, but it remained locked tight. "Victor," she said sharply. "Open it." Victor hesitated only briefly before entering the keypad code with trembling fingers. The metal door slowly swung open, and everyone inside the corridor went completely silent. Small cages lined the dimly lit room from floor to ceiling. Injured foxes, sedated exotic birds, thin monkeys curled together beneath blankets. Several animals wore medical tags from facilities Ethan had never heard of before. The room smelled sterile and cold, more like a forgotten laboratory than part of a public zoo. Sarah lowered her phone slowly, horrified. "Oh my God!" Ethan stepped inside, his chest tightening as frightened eyes stared back at him from every corner of the room. "How long has this been happening?" Victor looked ashamed. "Years." Helen suddenly stepped forward. "You do not understand the situation." Ethan spun toward her angrily. "Then explain it." Helen crossed her arms tightly, though her voice sounded less confident now. "Some private research organizations pay enormous amounts of money for animals with unusual intelligence or behavior. The zoo was drowning in debt. We were going to close within 2 years. Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "So you sold them?" "We relocated them," Helen corrected coldly. "Most of those facilities are legal." Ethan pointed toward the cages around him. "Then why hide them underground?" Helen had no answer. Before anyone spoke again, terrified screams suddenly echoed from upstairs. Officer Brooks grabbed his radio. "Report." Static crackled loudly before a shaky voice answered. "Milo is in the main atrium." Ethan immediately rushed toward the staircase with Sarah close behind him. When they reached the upper level, the scene looked unreal. Visitors who had remained trapped during lockdown huddled behind security barriers, while employees stood frozen near the entrance. In the middle of the atrium stood Milo. The massive silverback was surrounded by security staff carrying tranquilizer rifles, but he was not charging or threatening anyone. Instead, Milo stood protectively in front of a young chimpanzee, no older than 3 years old, that had somehow escaped from the hidden room downstairs during the chaos. The tiny animal clung nervously to Milo's side while the silverback glared at every armed guard around him. "Put the rifles down," Ethan shouted as he pushed through the crowd. One nervous guard shook his head. "Dr. Cole, he could turn any second." "No," Ethan replied firmly. "Look at him." Slowly, the room began to understand. Milo was shielding the smaller animal from the humans around him. Not attacking, protecting. Sarah noticed tears forming in the eyes of several employees as realization spread across the atrium. Milo had spent days desperately trying to warn them, and nobody listened, because they were too afraid of him. Helen finally entered the atrium moments later, stopping dead when she saw the escaped chimpanzee beside Milo. The silverback immediately turned toward her. His expression changed instantly. The room fell silent again as Milo slowly lifted one massive arm and pointed directly at Helen Morris. Then, in a voice rough but heartbreakingly clear, Milo spoke words that nobody inside Westbrook Wildlife Center would ever forget. "Humans hurt family." The entire atrium stood frozen after Milo's words echoed through the building. "Humans hurt family." Even the security guards holding tranquilizer rifles slowly lowered them as the reality of the situation finally settled over everyone inside Westbrook Wildlife Center. The small chimpanzee pressed closer against Milo's side, trembling beneath the bright overhead lights, while frightened visitors watched in stunned silence from behind the barriers. Ethan carefully stepped forward with his hands visible, his heart pounding harder than ever before. "Milo," he said softly, "it is okay." The silverback turned his eyes toward Ethan immediately. For the first time since the chaos began, there was no anger in Milo's expression, only exhaustion. Sarah Bennett stood nearby, recording everything with tears forming in her eyes as emergency vehicles arrived outside the facility. News helicopters circled overhead, while federal wildlife officers rushed through the zoo entrance below. The story had already exploded nationwide, but nobody outside truly understood what was happening inside the atrium at that moment. Ethan moved another step closer. "You were trying to protect them this whole time, were not you?" Milo slowly lowered himself beside the frightened chimpanzee and wrapped one massive arm gently around the smaller animal. Several employees began quietly crying at the sight. Officer Brooks turned toward Helen Morris with visible disbelief. How many animals were hidden downstairs? Helen remained silent. Her carefully controlled expression had completely collapsed now as flashing police lights reflected across the atrium windows. Victor Lane sat against the far wall with his head lowered, looking more relieved than afraid. Sarah approached him slowly. "Why did you stay if you knew what was happening?" Victor swallowed hard before answering. "Because someone had to keep them alive." Ethan looked back toward Milo, and suddenly everything made sense. The strange behavior, the warnings, the fear every time Victor entered the corridor. Milo had witnessed the hidden animals being moved through the underground rooms for years, and he had learned human words while desperately trying to understand why it was happening. The silverback had not become dangerous because he could speak. He became desperate because nobody listened. A federal wildlife officer finally entered the atrium with 2 agents beside him. "Dr. Cole," he said carefully, "we need the area cleared immediately." Ethan shook his head. "Nobody rushes him." The officer glanced nervously toward Milo. "That gorilla escaped containment. To save a child," Sarah interrupted firmly while pointing toward the small chimpanzee beside him. The officer hesitated. Even he could see the truth standing right in front of him now. Milo was not threatening anyone. He was protecting someone weaker than himself. Slowly, Ethan crouched lower near the enclosure barrier and extended his hand carefully toward the glass partition separating them. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. Milo stared at him for several long seconds before slowly lifting his own hand and placing it against the glass opposite Ethan's palm. The atrium remained completely silent except for distant thunder outside. Then something happened that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Milo looked directly at the frightened chimpanzee beside him, then back toward Ethan, and quietly spoke again. "Safe now." Ethan felt tears burn his eyes immediately. The silverback did not care about fame, attention, or fear. He only wanted to know if the others were finally safe. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered emotionally. "They are safe now." Around the atrium, employees who once feared Milo now looked at him completely differently. Not as a monster, not as some unnatural creature, but as a living being who understood pain, fear, family, and kindness. Far more deeply than anyone ever imagined. Sarah lowered her camera briefly, wiping tears from her face as emergency teams carefully began removing the rescued animals from the underground rooms below. One by one, frightened creatures were carried past the atrium toward waiting medical vans outside. Each time an animal passed nearby, Milo quietly watched them leave while keeping the small chimpanzee protected beside him. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the massive silverback finally looked calm. 3 months later, Westbrook Wildlife Center looked completely different. Federal investigators had shut down the hidden underground operation, and several major wildlife organizations stepped in to help rehabilitate the rescued animals. News coverage about the case spread across the world, but the part people talked about most was not the scandal itself. It was Milo. Millions of people watched the footage of the silverback protecting the frightened chimpanzee in the atrium. Scientists debated his intelligence on television while psychologists argued about whether animals could truly understand morality and empathy. But for Ethan Cole, none of those discussions mattered anymore. Because every single day he saw the answer with his own eyes. Early one quiet morning, Ethan walked through the newly renovated primate sanctuary carrying a small basket of fruit beneath a pale Colorado sunrise. The crowds were gone now. The media attention had slowly faded, and for the first time in months, peace had finally returned to the facility. Birds chirped softly through the trees, while cool mountain air drifted across the outdoor habitat. Ethan stopped near the edge of the enclosure where Milo sat beneath a large oak tree, watching the younger chimpanzee play nearby. The little animal looked healthier now, energetic and curious instead of frightened. Milo watched over him carefully, calm dark eyes following every movement like a protective older brother. Ethan smiled softly. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. Milo looked toward him and slowly approached the glass barrier. There was no fear anymore between them, no confusion, Only understanding. Ethan placed the basket near the feeding hatch before sitting on the wooden bench outside the enclosure. You know, he said with a tired laugh, the whole world thinks you are the most incredible animal alive. Milo tilted his head slightly as though listening carefully. Ethan shook his head. But I think they missed the point. The silverback remained silent. Ethan stared across the sanctuary thoughtfully while sunlight filtered through the trees overhead. People are amazed because you can talk, he continued softly. But that was never the important part. Milo slowly sat down across from him on the other side of the glass. Ethan felt emotion tighten in his throat as he looked into the gorilla's eyes. The important part is that you cared. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then the younger chimpanzee suddenly ran across the enclosure holding a bright yellow ball before tumbling clumsily into the grass. Milo immediately turned to check on him. The small animal chirped happily, completely unharmed, and Milo visibly relaxed again. Ethan smiled through watery eyes. Even now, after everything that happened, Milo's first instinct was still to protect someone else. Footsteps approached behind Ethan as Sarah Bennett entered the sanctuary carrying a small camera bag over her shoulder. Mind if I join you? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded toward the bench beside him. Sarah sat down and looked through the glass toward Milo. Hard to believe how much changed in just a few months. Ethan laughed softly. Not for him. Sarah watched Milo carefully for a moment before speaking again. Do you think he understands what he did for those animals? Ethan glanced toward the silverback. I think he understood long before we did. Sarah slowly lifted her camera, but this time she did not point it directly at Milo. Instead, she lowered it again and simply watched quietly. Some moments felt too human to record. As the morning sun climbed higher above the sanctuary, the younger chimpanzee curled beside Milo beneath the oak tree and slowly drifted to sleep. The silverback gently rested one massive hand across the smaller animal's back protectively. Ethan felt his chest tighten again.